So as we continue on with Isaiah 40, there's another really interesting little turn of events in the text. So last week we were thinking that Isaiah was presenting to us anthropomorphisms, that God is a warrior, God is like a shepherd, and so taking human form and function and relating it to God to teach us something theological. Now, as soon as that's done, Isaiah immediately switches tactic and really just raises his eyes to the cosmos, to creation, and says, who put all this together? Who holds the mountains in their hands? Who can counsel God? Who can hold the waters? The coastlines are like dust. The nations are like nothing. So the grandness, the transcendent creativity of God is now in focus. The fact that God knows infinitely more than we do, that we cannot deem to be his counselor, and that all of creation exists because of and through God's good pleasure. So he uses anthropomorphisms, and then he uses this transcendence language of the magnitude of God, the fountainous power and creativity of God that is at work. Then there's this interesting maneuver in the text where he says, if you take all the forests of Lebanon and all the livestock available, even that would be an offering far too small. It would never be sufficient to appropriately represent the grandeur and offer worship to God. And then he takes this little next step and says, you go to idols. You go to a craftsman who's going to put together a nice little gold statue. If you can't afford gold, you get somebody to whittle something out of wood in the form of an animal or a person, and you would consider that to be your God. So here, right in the middle of Isaiah 40, Israel is rebuked for idolatry. And that is a really interesting insight that I think we need to slow down and pay attention to. When we look back in the history of Israel, there's all kinds of moments where they lose their way and they give themselves to false and lesser gods. The one classic moment that is sort of burned into the whole Christian narrative is, of course, the golden calf, when at the foot of Mount Sinai, where God is really at the top of the mountain in thunder and power and greatness with Moses, the Israelites and Aaron are at the bottom of the mountain, and they decide to hatch this plan and make for themselves a false god, a lesser god. But the twist in this is that Aaron calls the people together and says, tomorrow we will have a feast to Yahweh. And when he says Yahweh, he points to the golden calf. He says, this is the Yahweh that brought us out of Egypt. So really interesting, so that Aaron is not so much rejecting Yahweh, Aaron is rejecting the Yahweh that is at the top of the mountain, that is too much for them to handle, too fierce, too ferocious. And at the bottom of the mountain, they decide to make for themselves a lesser, more trivial version of this God, and yet still want to follow Yahweh. And so I think we can be challenged by that, because what is at stake here is not so much their loyalty to Yahweh, the Lord. What's at stake here is their vision of Yahweh, their theology, that they would rather have a smaller theology, a shrunk vision, a lesser spectacle, where God really is reduced to being something of their making rather than the God that is transcendent and above all. And we can actually fall into the same trap. We can stumble into the same forms of idolatry, where it's not that we're rejecting God, but neither are we embracing the grandness and the transcendence and the otherness and the power and the magnitude of who God is and what he makes available of himself to us. So again, not Israel always rejecting God, but rather rejecting the fullness of God. And a good challenge for us to consider those things as well. Till next time, peace.